Welcome to Survivor Space and this Survivor Circle conversation. I'm Becky Perkins, Survivor Support Specialist with Zero Abuse Project. Very, very pleased to see and to welcome back my good friend Kiesa K. I've missed you. It's so wonderful to see your face on my screen. And you always have the most amazing guests for your conversation. And today is no exception. Very, very pleased to meet and get to learn from Denise Lowe, who's Kansas Poet Laureate Emeritus and so many other amazing things. So I can't wait to hear your conversation. Before we get started, I need to give a grateful and obligatory shout out to our funders, the Office for Victims of Crime, for providing support to all of Survivor Space, including our survivor circles. So thank you both so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you, Kaisa.
Thank you. It's a really big honor for me to be talking to you, Denise. Our guest today is Denise Lowe, and she's a former poet laureate of Kansas, author of House of Grace, House of Blood, and freelance editor of poetry and prose, and she does developmental editing. She's amazing. Her awards include a Red Mountain Press Editor's Choice Poetry Award, Best of the Internet nomination, 5 Pushcart Prize nominations, 4 Kansas Notable Book Awards, many, many other honors. Denise is not only Kansas Poet Laureate Emeritus, but she was a professor and administrator at Haskell Indian Nations University, and she founded the creative writing program there. And she co-founded Mammoth Publications with her husband, Tom Wiseau, and she's a founding member of Indigenous Nations Poets. Welcome, Denise.
Hi, it's great
Hi.
to see you. And it's like you always end up on the wrong coast of the wrong continent, but we see each other regularly on Zoom, and I treasure those moments.
Oh, I feel the same. I feel the same. Now, the first time I ever found your poetry, it was in a
Uh,
poem that you'd written for The Courage to Heal, and it was quite moving.
that was years and years ago. My
It was.
gosh.
It was. And
Yes.
I sort of wanted to start with an acknowledgement of the land that we're on right now. I'm
Okay.
on um, Cherokee land, and I believe where are you? Where you are now? California.
I am in Healdsburg, Sonoma County, 85 miles north of San Francisco.
Oh, so we are completely on opposite ends of the
Yes,
continent together.
yes, yes.
Yes, yes. I wondered if you would mind telling me what land means to you, being on the land. What's the healing perspective on that?
Well, it is the mother, the father, the parent, the origin substance, the energy that permeates our food, our water, our air, the heat that comes into our bodies, and like in 7 years, your all your molecules are replaced if you're in a different place. And I did move from Kansas. Happy Kansas Day, everybody. It is today. And we have someone in the participant from Topeka, I notice, so that we can spread that news. But she also, it's all a healer. I love the saying that I read in a book about Lenape or Navajo people once. The land is a mother that never dies.
Yes, the land is a mother that never dies. I think that's true. And I really don't know how I would have fared if I hadn't grown up in rural Kansas. I think there was something very healing about the land there, about the ability to see the big sky and just to be really close to nature in that special way. And I know we share that. And when I
Yeah.
was little, I loved Ad Astra per Aspera, to the
Yes.
stars through difficulties, because that
Yes.
just seems to summarize what you and I both have done. It's true. Would you? I really wanted to focus a little on your new book of poetry, House of
Okay.
Grace, House of Blood, and I wondered if you'd be willing to read maybe one of the some of the poems from there. Maybe acknowledgement of Lenape lands. page 65. Would you be willing to read that?
Okay, thanks so much. And I think that is a good way to start as we're talking about land. I'll say something about land acknowledgements. I think they are important to do the mental shift to appreciate the special groups of people who are still connected and active with this land. And I think that as every time I hear one, I think, how can I actively support that community now? Um,
Yes.
Cherokee or Chalagi people, Tsalagi. Um,
Mhm.
I have some background. I've taken some of the language. And, I grew up with many people and in Emporia, Kansas, Southeast Kansas, where people were still, I heard Cherokee language on the playground and have some heritage through the Thomas Foreman family. So that's near and dear to me. And then on my grandfather's side, he was a descendant of and had heritage with a number of East Coast Lenape or Algonquin bands. And it's hard to describe, something that's, 400 years ago, well, 500 years ago, they started interacting with Europeans. And it's a very different history than what happened west of the Mississippi. So this acknowledgement is kind of about that diaspora. And I want to, and they were traders who traveled a lot. One of the man falling leaves actually led Zebulon Pike up Pike's Peak. It should be Falling Leaves Peak. Um, so this is acknowledgement of Lenape lands. In Dawnland, through 5 centuries, Lenapes fight Spanish, Swedes, Dutch, English, and United States settlers. Bloodstained roads lead away from New Jersey, escape routes shared by Lenapes and runaway Africans. Blood memory stories mark murders at Dutch Pavonia, at Coshocton, at Gnadenhutten, where militia killed pacifist Lenape Indians. Descendants live in the Ramapo Mountains, Appalachians of Pennsylvania and Ohio, Canada, Wisconsin, India, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Idaho. Lenape people are alive, hearts beating streams of red blood. All the lands and waters where we continue, I acknowledge.
Mm. Blood-stained roads, blood memory stories, blood passing through mother's red wombs. Again and again, it's like it runs like a river through this so deeply, so deeply. Mhm.
Yeah.
I want you to share with me a little bit more about your Delaware heritage, your connection to your Delaware grandfather, and what it has meant to you through your life to be able to turn to him, to call to him in memory. In your memoir, it is so extraordinarily beautiful when you mention him, and
Thank
you
you.
just explore that so deeply. The turtle's beating heart, one family story of Lenape survival, and it just seems to me that you never released that part of your heritage, even when you hadn't been told about it. It was like it was in you and of you in a very deep and meaningful way.
Well, I appreciate that. It's amazing how these family stories and impressions and the intelligence we have as little children and our memories. Um, I remember both of all four of my grandparents. I was lucky to have all of them. I remember things were not always smooth at home. My parents battled back and forth. Um, but my dad had extreme political views. He was a Democrat in Kansas, if you understand what that means. He was the Democrat county chairman in Kansas. And
Oh
by
my,
golly, he was one of these people who helped get a Democrat uh, governor elected. And currently we have a
Southland.
Democrat governor. Kansas are kind of independent minded. Just and so my dad admired his father-in-law. My mother's father um, was a humble man. He worked on the railroad and was a union man and a Democrat. And by golly, my dad, who grown up wealthy with a Republican grandfather in a small town who's kind of top of the heap, he turned to his father-in-law and shifted all of his beliefs. And
Mhm.
I never found out how that happened.
Mhm.
But, I remember maybe two conversations with my dad's dad. I remember every single conversation with my Delaware grandfather. And people would say of him, he doesn't speak much, but when he does, people listen.
Yes.
He
Yes.
has something to say.
Would you read Walking with My Delaware Grandfather? It's on
Sure.
page 30. I love
And
that.
and let me give this a little bit of geography, if I may. He was born in 1885 or so. He married a German-Irish settler woman in Kansas City, where miscegenation was not illegal. On the Missouri side, it was illegal for races to intermarry until 1967. And so you will see all these mixed race people coming out of Kansas City, Kansas, like Charlie Parker, when the first Indian and Black college basketball coach came from Kansas City, Kansas, McClellan, and so forth. So this takes place partly in Kansas City, Kansas, okay, with his mom and dad. So, and another thing, the lineages go down through the genders. So he had my mother, and he did not teach her that much, but he taught my brother things. Um, so his wife, my grandmother, was German Irish, and of course, so there's a kind of a break in the link there. So that's another just sort of cultural way that makes for greater alienation. But still, walking with my Delaware grandfather. Walking home, I feel a presence following and realize he is always there, that native man with coal black hair who is my grandfather. In my first memories, he is present, mostly wordless, resident in the house where I was born. My mother shows him the cleft in my chin, identical to his, and I am swaddled and blinking in the kitchen light, so we are introduced. We never part. Sometimes I forget he lodges in my house still, the bone house where my heart beats. I carry his mother's framework, a sturdy structure. I learn his birthright. I hear his mother's teachings through what my mother said of her. She kept a pot of stew on the stove and all day for anyone to eat. She never went to church, but said, "You could be a good person anyway." Every person has rights, no matter what color, be respectful. She fed hobos during the 30s, her back porch, a regular stopover. This son of hers, my grandfather, still walks the streets with me. Some twist of blood and heat still spark across the time bridge. Here, listen. Air draws through these lungs made from his. His blood still pulses in this hand.
His blood still pulses in this hand. Oh, I love.
You know,
One,
one of the things I appreciate about the feminist movement, among many, um, he was the connection to body, that you don't cut out your body and alienate yourself from it, that everything does come back to we are here in flesh bodies. So
we are an embodied presence. Yes. And yet, even when disembodied, still so present. Yeah.
yeah.
One of the things that was somewhat, uh, quite frankly, painful about your book, this book, one of the things was that your family hid your Delaware identity.
Yes.
It was like it was a family secret. And on I think it's page 43. Let me see if I can get it up. This there's a sentence in here that I must have read it over and over again because I couldn't quite grasp it. Uh, it says Native children could be removed and forced to attend distant boarding schools with Christian sponsors. Indian agents maintain control of any financial assets. And then you said, my family chose to suppress their native heritage so they could keep their children. So they could keep their children. They kept their families intact without knowing that the process of self-denial would have long-range ripples. Erasure of identity has costs, but survival trumps everything else. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking they had to hide their native heritage, which means a complete loss of this entire cultural self in order to keep their children. It was almost like they had to cut off the past to keep the present and the future. And that is, I mean, cultural genocide, obviously. And I wondered if you'd want to elaborate on that uh, a bit and on how that was something that you tried to overcome that suppression. I mean, you went on to be very active with Haskell Indian Nations University, and you've really embraced your entire identity. And what was that like for you, both
Oh,
to grow up in an atmosphere of suppression, when if
yeah.
you'd crossed the state lines, your family would have been illegal, you
Right.
know, and
Right.
also
Right.
really, and then to reclaim that for yourself. It's
Well, thank you. And one of the things I will say first is being at Haskell for 27 years, it was incredible how much culture remains. And even though there have been horrific losses, somehow there's this ability of Native people to prioritize what works. And one of the things that really works in terms of long-term survival is cultural identity. And and the government figured that out and tried to break that down. But there were, like, well, I'd like to think about Langston Hughes, who was part Pamunkey Indian from Virginia, part Cherokee from Virginia, and then also part African American. And then there's also Ralph Quarles, who was white, and uh, uh, other folks who were in the equation who were slaveholders and white. But but when Langston Hughes was growing up in Lawrence, Kansas, he was segregated grades one to third grade, fourth grade, and then they were integrated, and he went to the junior high in with everybody else, and the high school with everybody else. One teacher tried to segregate all the African American students, and Langston Hughes led a protest against that, and he won. And so the kids continued to be seated alphabetically and not by race. And
Mhm.
it was like there were enough small victories. There were enough uh, well-meaning people of all along the way of all stripes, and so that there are some places where the Constitution has held up. And there are many, many places where it is not. But the genocide has failed, I guess is what is the good
Yes,
news.
yes, the genocide
There-
has failed. Yes.
and so myself in the family where my grandfather clearly made a point to never talk about it. Well, once in a while his wife would grumble about his Indian blood. My brother who grew up and was trained by him, and by the way, my brother taught me how to Indian wrestle when I was a little kid. Um, you know, he would. I knew there were things in the background, and then there's the physicality. It goes back to the looks of like, oh yeah, aren't we supposed to be blonde? My mother would always say, oh, we're blonde Germans is our background. Well, this is her father. He's not blonde and he's not German, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
Um, but somehow she had us all convinced that we were blonde Germans, and I and also while I'm doing show and tell, this is my mother is a young woman who neither is she a blonde, European. She's
Hmm.
so I grew up with these contradictions, and at some point, I just started putting things together when I taught at Haskell, where I became much more used to seeing people who were full, many of the Southwest tribes have been able to keep their genetic profile. I also met many who were many variations. And I began to understand that it's the cultural identity and the spiritual values. And any elder that came to Haskell to speak would always go back to Native people, they would say Indians, are very spiritual people, and that's what is our identity. That's what keeps our communities together. So those are the things that I came to understand both from the physicality and I would have people come at Haskell come up to me and assume I was mixed blood. In fact, some prominent writers would say, "Oh, what tribe are you?" And I would, well, you know, nothing, I guess. But then I started to look into the geography of where our family had lived and found some census records and found some more information. I did oral interviews with my relatives, my uncle, and it was interesting. My grandfather had not said anything to my mother, but he had talked to his son, my uncle, and also to my brother. So they were a
So
big source.
it was like a treasure hunt to discover who you were. It was
It
like
it
a,
was. And
yeah.
and it was a relief because I always wondered why I was out of step with the some of it, and then some friends in Emporia I just naturally feel comfortable with. Well, it turns out they were also mixed blood or native. Um, and it was just interesting how people interact. Just it was such a relief to find out I wasn't just odd.
Oh, oh, never found you odd, but I hear what you're saying, that that's how it was feeling to you.
Yeah,
I wonder, is it like the poem you wrote, A Mixed Bloods Questions? Was that part of your, how was
yeah,
that part of the journey? I don't know if you'd want to share that one now, but
yeah. Let me,
it
um,
seems,
what
and
page is that on?
and that's on page 13. And stop me if I'm being too directive. I love
No,
when you
no,
read your,
no,
I
please
love
do.
hearing your words from your mouth. I love reading when you read
No,
your
no,
poetry. It just
I'm
lives, just
just trying to not just ramble, so thank
oh,
you.
you never ramble.
Okay,
You know,
so,
if I were you,
um,
I would have such an ego. My ego would be this big; it would fill the room. And yet, you are the most uh, giving person. You know, you
well,
always remind me that I put my pants on one leg at a time, the same way you do, and not to be too much in awe. But I would, you just amaze
well,
me. But it's yeah, it's page 13.
yeah, thank you. And this is based on Linda Hogan's poem about being a mixed blood, and so I borrowed that from her, The Hands in the Pocket. A mixed blood questions, which hand do I choose? So quick am I to say the clean one, not the bloody one that prevailed. Only blameless martyrs made my body, I say, not brutes. Which grandfather rides a wagon on red brick streets and never arrives? Which grandmother sets aside sewing, banks embers, and cannot sleep? Both Lenapes and whites live in wooden frame houses, both fight Southern slaveholders, both tend apple orchards and homesteads. They farm corn, beans, and squash, plants alive in my flesh, whose bodies are untainted. What blood passes to me only in acts of love.
Oh, which hand do I choose? To me, this fits so beautifully with walking with your Delaware grandfather and the hand.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just like there's a connection so deep. And how do you answer the questions in this poem for yourself?
Um, there are various ways, various days. I think that part of being mixed blood is I do feel connections to several worlds at once, walking into worlds. And I just kind of have a rotation of self-comfort things, and chocolate chip cookies is right up there because of course chocolate is indigenous, but the dairy is not. So, there are ways that you can combine these things successfully. Um, when I was at Haskell, I noticed there were many people of mixed tribal descents. And one of the things that they would do is either do both. And if there were three or four or five or six tribes, sometimes they would choose one and just say, I have these families, I follow the Kiowa way. Like my friend Jenny James was of four or five tribes, but she said, but then she danced and did her ceremonies. And I think it's where you do ceremonies is I probably the first place to look um, for, but not always.
Where you do ceremonies.
Yeah.
What did you find as you were uncovering and discovering and learning more and more about your own family's history? What did you uncover, or what did you reach any conclusions based on your own lived experience around intergenerational trauma and
But
around the idea that we have
sure.
this inner turmoil and that somehow the turmoil of the past is passed down?
Sure, sure. Um, I will disclose, and I don't think it's any great secret from if you look at some of my other writings that there were self-medications with alcohol. There were losses in our family, and people talk about Native Americans having a special susceptibility. I would argue that Russians, Irish, Germans, French, you name it, we all have a can have susceptibilities. Um, but what is behind that is what did you grow up with? What did we grow up with? And my mother was always so afraid I'd be taken away that it was just, and then I understood the boarding school thing, the sudden deaths, the diseases, there, and this isn't unique to Native peoples, but in terms of the diseases and the poverty and Lord knows the Irish went through horrible things, and
Mhm.
but
But the fear,
definitely the sense that and my grandfather told me about being tarred and feathered,
oh,
and you know the public humiliation in those days. It wasn't asphalt tar, it was more pine pitch, which
horrible,
but
horrible.
but he let me know that happened to him,
Mhm.
even though I was a little kid, and he kind of told me when no one else was around. But I'm thinking, who would want to hurt my grandfather, this nice old guy? Um, and I honestly was so used to seeing who, what he looked like. It didn't even, and then suddenly it hit me. Oh, he was brown. He
Mm.
he he was
Oh,
a brown
oh,
man. And
oh.
and I honestly, when you grow up in your family, and there's some of you have blue eyes, blonde hair, and some have black hair or brown eyes, and it's all kind of a jumble. When you're a kid, you don't make those distinctions.
Mhm.
And so anyway, that became very important for me to um, understand why there was um, failure, um, self-sabotage, fear, um, self-denigration, denigration of others, internalization of um, beating oneself up, and some violence and abuse of alcohol. Um, all of these things and drugs.
Well,
And
thank
certainly they've gone through my family, nieces, nephews, and so forth.
I'm thinking that as we move through our lives, we recover from the things that have happened to us. And sometimes while we're learning, while we're recovering, we have children, and they are part and process
Yeah,
of our process, and they bear witness not
right,
only to how much we love them, but to the deep healing work that we have to do. And the deeper the work, the harder the journey, the more that they bear witness to as we
right,
move along
right.
the higher planes. And of course, some of us won't move along, but
And
I
and
want,
and I do want to emphasize also that also in my family there have been nieces and nephews, or nephews who've and nieces who've done great, who've managed to overcome. So I don't want to disparage or paint this, victim thing, but there, I experienced pain growing up, and I figured one time that all through high school I was depressed. once I learned to put a name to something, I realized, oh yeah, that was my high school years.
I've thought about it. I don't have the heritage that you have, but I've thought about it in my own family with the multi-generational trauma. And I think that every generation tries to overcome, to do better, to
Yeah,
rise farther. And I had this amazing fantasy that somehow I was going to leap victoriously and completely healed from my 20s,
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's just not that easy. It's not that easy. And
Hmm.
and this is but this is a deeper pain. I'm thinking of um, how House of Grace, House of Blood focuses on a massacre and in so many ways. And I am wondering what made you choose that as the focus for this, and how did that, this might be multifaceted, but how did that aid your understanding and your healing work?
Thank you. I'm glad you asked it that way because when people ask me what the book's about, and I say it's about the 1782 massacre, you know, of Christianized Lenape native people by a group of renegade revolutionary soldiers, among whom was probably one of my great greats um, on the white side, and it's first is just acknowledging that there's no ethnicity without bad people. That violence is inherent in every human being, and it's just part of our tool set. And we try to understand that there are domination struggles throughout history. Um, and certainly and it oddly that helped me to get perspective and again not be the victim, not laden people with guilt. These were greedy, horrible men who perpetuated this massacre. And I sure in their Canaan, their fundamentalists tell they're still there. Um, but people escaped, they survived, they were not eradicated. The values that sustain life and build cultures and build generosity and kindness and goodwill, these are more prevalent. There were Moravian missionaries who worked with this particular group of the survivors and who recorded this. And one of the reasons I took this up was, and I need to cough, I just,
Mhm.
um, who were helping them and gave them voice. And when a couple of the boys escaped and they went back to the missionaries, they could read and write. They talked to the missionaries, they recorded this, and that account comes down today. And there are very few incidents like this that are documented so well. And there
Oh,
are hundreds and thousands of massacres like this that occurred in the last 500 plus years.
mm,
And mostly they were not recorded. But and this is maybe one of the first that was well recorded. So maybe that's some answers to that question, but
yeah.
I could go on and on.
Well, it's fascinating. And
Yeah.
did you find within yourself a healing from doing this research, doing this writing, bringing
I
this to light in this way?
It was hard to read about this.
Mm,
Um, and it did help me face it. And this was not the worst. There were worse massacres I read about. Um, but it did help me to appreciate the complexities and finally the survival that, one woman just happened to leave the church building because her baby was fussing and she didn't want to disturb the congregation. And so she was out in the woods trying to get her baby to calm down, and she saw this militia coming along, and so she also witnessed it. Escaped, was in the woods 3 days without anybody, but found some hunters who had been traveling with the party, and they went back and tried to find survivors. There were none, and that they could find, and so they went back up to Canada. So through my own healing, it's like you do get away. And I don't know, I've been in some dicey situations where I did get away. I was left and found my way back.
And it can be on something so simple as a fussy baby. The simplest turn. I wonder if you would want to read Genocide Mathematics, because you spoke about how much this
Yeah,
was.
and
It's a
this I think it's important that people are beginning to understand how institutionalized the genocide against Native peoples was, especially here in California, where you also had a bounty system. But there is a document I based this poem on, of the governor of Pennsylvania declaring bounties on Indian scalps. So much for men, so much for women, so much for children. And this is a state order, it's institutionalized in state law and regulations, whatever. And, there's all this thing about Indians being wild savages and scalping.
no, no, no,
I'm not
no.
even, yeah, anyway. So this is genocide mathematics, story problem. Quote, the Pennsylvania militia brought back 96 scalps. Who made this grisly count? Were they laid out on display and totaled? Quote, according to computation made by the missionaries, the number of Delaware Christian victims was 90. They killed Christian converts and traditional Lenapes, mutilated the bodies, and burned everyone together. Quote, 6 of the murdered ones must have been heathen visitors at Gnadenhutten. 96 minus 90 equals 6. Conversion tables, value of a life. In continental dollars, $2,500 per bounty as decreed by the governor equal $33.33 sterling. Sums. 96 scalps at $33.33 apiece equal $3,199.68. $1 in 1776 in purchasing power is $34.58 in 2023. Sums. Bounties for 96 people equal 3,199.63 sterling in 1782. Sums. Bounties for 96 people equal $110,643.21 in 2023. Sums. Bounty per person equal $33.33 sterling in 1782. Sums. Bounty per person $1,152.53 in 2023.
It's
Yeah.
so cold. It's so cold. and so terrifying in a totally different way.
It it is, and there torture. I don't want to read the history of torture, but in England, beheading, all of the ways they executed people. These were holidays that people would take the kids to and a picnic lunch. There were the Spanish Inquisition was concurrent with some of this early colonial, pre-colonial history, and it was a different world.
It was a great blessing. The order of your poems in this book is a great blessing. It was like you were beside the reader because the next poem helped me so much with the feelings that have been stirred up by the previous one. Do you want to share that one? It's Night Terrors. It's on page 19. And
Okay.
that they came one right after the other. It was like, ah, and then a breath.
I really did try to um keep it from just being a diatribe.
Mhm.
Um, but and I learned this from Lucy Tapahanso. Uh, she always began each reading with a song and ended each reading with a prayer. And so Night Terrors, right? I awaken and switch on a lamp. My Lenape grandfather is already awake. We listen in the dark. Cicadas drone with the wind. Tonight, nothing worse.
Tonight, nothing worse. It's like in this moment, just being able to take a free breath, nothing
Yes.
worse. The other poem that kind of help when you're reading poems that have a lot of trauma piece to them, and you're realizing things that perhaps you were ignorant of in the past, then you find something, however mild, that just helps. It just helps. And the one you have on page 48, Some Survived, had that same sort of, I don't know how to explain it, but I wondered if you would share that one.
Okay, I shall. This one is sort of a statement against well, people say Indians are in the past, why bother with them? And you're only part Indian, and the majority of you is white, so just go with the white. Um, and this is, no, the native people survive, and they may not be in the form that the oppressors or the winners wish to acknowledge, but we're here. The Some survive. The Lenapes not killed. Jacob, who watches from behind a tree. A boy who hides under bloody floorboards, also named Jacob. One who feigns death in a heap of bodies, named Thomas. A small boy, Benjamin, saved by Obadiah Holmes. A woman and her baby hidden in trees beside the road, Shebash's second son, away when the militia arrives. Those in a nearby village warned by Jacob and Thomas. Refugees flee Gnadenhutten to Apple Creek, where my grandparents will live, to Sugar Creek, where other grandparents will live, to Captive Town on the Sandusky River, north to Canada, east back to Lenape-Hoking, west into the forests, southwest into the grasslands. Delaware's alive today, enrolled or not, adopted, orphaned, hidden. We all survive genocide.
We all survive.
And I should make a point here that I am not enrolled. I cannot say I am a Delaware person. I can say I have heritage, And I can say my family participates in this history. And I
Mhm.
just want this story out. I don't want to get rich. Who's going to get rich from poetry?
Well, you're quite, you're it's amazing because it's a matter of rich. You're so rich already in friends, in love, in family, and in all the things that matter most in a lifetime. And to what extent do you think acknowledging your roots and your heritage has enriched your life?
Well, it has brought me peace, and it's given me patience and understanding of some of the difficulties that my parents, grandparents, great grandparents, great greats faced. The 7 generations before, and I'm trying to make the world better for the 7 generations to come.
Mhm. You were married to Tom Wiseau, and
Mhm.
I'm deep condolences that he's no longer embodied. But can you tell me something about how your marriage emboldened and strengthened you?
How our marriage what?
Emboldened or strengthened you in
Oh,
that
okay.
ways?
Well, I
Sorry,
survived Tom.
there's that.
There's that, and he survived me. I
Mhm.
think by the time it was over.
You're
Um,
both forces in nature,
yeah, it was.
larger than life. Mhm.
Oh, he and I, found common ground in the way we dealt with gender. And that's in a marriage relationship. I mean, that's kind the underlying unconscious understanding of gender. Um, and his was my third marriage. My marriage with him was my third, and my apologies to the poor gentleman who survived me one and two. But he understood that what I could do, and he turned his checkbook over to me. That was smart. You know, he provided support and sustenance, and he shared many of his life experiences with me and his family. He shared his family. I'm still close to them, and I appreciate their generosity with me. He shared medicine ways, and he especially living outside his community so much, he needed a partner at times for that. So it was he also had one of the most traumatic childhoods I've ever heard of. And at the same time, when he was being beaten, incredible prejudice, like the junior high coach beat him up because he won something over his son, the gym coach's son, and so the gym coach beat up this little kid. Um, just things that the mental frustrations. Like he and his cousin were getting the best grades in algebra. His family's mathematically gifted, and they couldn't get above C's because that school did not give above a C to Native persons.
Oh, he
So,
dealt constantly with it. Lifelong, he dealt constantly with the prejudice, with the racism, with them
right.
constantly. There was
And
no escape.
and violence. So he survived, but he was really pretty. And he did therapy. I mean, the thing about Tom is he would humble himself enough to go into a therapist and try to say, I want to do better.
And he was a very successful writer
He
after,
was.
I mean, a brilliant, brilliant writer. And to, and you too, to what extent did your writing feed each other? Did you support each other in your writing that? I mean, imagine you're listening to each other.
Well, he courted me by telling me stories. He figured out he wanted a relationship, and he was a very smart guy, and he says, "How do I get this woman?" Well, he read all of my poetry books, and then the other horrible thing I realized, he watched a lot of old movies, and I didn't realize this, but he would pull out these wonderful lines. And then years later, we'd be watching an old movie, and there's Humphrey Bogart making this, we'll always have Kansas City, won't we, Denise? Kinds of lines. And
Aw.
so he read a lot. I mean, he was a kind of a nerdy Indian on his res. And so people sort of make the false assumption I wrote his books. Let me tell you,
No, no.
I could not, in my wildest dreams, come up with things. His book, Survival Food, is won a Penn Award uh, here in the Bay Area. It was featured in the uh, National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. last summer. It was published, like 6 months after he died, and it's done wonderfully well. I just wish he'd been alive. But you know, because we talked every day, and he told me stories, he was never boring. And that was very important to me in a relationship.
That's right.
So that's
Right.
how we and of course I'm a great copy editor. And I did proofread his work. I did make suggestions in very few places,
Mhm.
like how to wind things up was something that he needed to learn. I helped him with organization of the overall structure, and that's about it.
Yeah. And it makes me think of the what Rodin said about Camille Claudel. He said the gold he found was his own.
Yeah.
The gold she found was, I mean, that was his
That's
gold. That's
that,
his
that
gold.
that's
Yeah.
well
And
put.
and where are you now in terms of your healing, feeling at peace? Where are you now with all of this?
Well,
It's been a rough year
it's
because
been,
he passed this year.
Tom died a year and a half ago, and the
Yeah,
first year was horrible. It was
yeah.
just awful in many, many levels, but also very spiritual. And I became much more aware of how much spirit continues and and resides within us. And I appreciate the dear friends who gave me support through all sorts of dark moments. Today I have moments of loneliness. I will certainly say that, but I also am pretty happy a lot of the time, or peaceful, feeling, my kids are doing great. My stepdaughter and her family are doing fine and great. And Diane Willie, my chosen daughter, is doing great. And I have friends in Healdsburg and some grandkids and um, lots of interesting people to talk to on Zoom.
Well, you ended your book. The last poem in this book is Stomp Dance, Wyandotte County, Kansas.
Hmm.
I thought, we're just about at 5 o'clock. I wondered if you would let us end with you reading that poem. It's
Okay.
on 101 on this. I just love it. I love them all. But
Well, I appreciate that. And, one of the ways that Delawares have survived is by connecting with their neighbors wherever they've lived.
Mhm.
And Stomp Dance is actually Cherokee and Southeast, and was not their tradition at all.
Mhm.
But the Delawares have lived side by side with Cherokees for a century and a half, almost 2 century. Um, and so they have taken on this dance, and I was grateful to a falling leaf descendant who led this particular stomp dance in Wyandotte County. Stomp dance, Wyandotte County, Kansas. The lead man lifts his black hat and calls from the center. I wait for the tail end of the man-woman procession. Lead women are shell shakers. Double time steps, rustle, turtle shell rattles tied to shins. Men sing and sing loud. Women step, step hard. The inner circle turns sideways to the fire. My grandfather and grandmother lived on Lenape land near this spot. Their footprints remain in this ground. The leader raises his arm for each new song. Men answer. Their breath lifts into the wind. I remember Josiah, what he said about tobacco. The headman offers it to the fire. I remember the Foley family and their stomp ground near Copan. I remember Cherokees who dance, Redbird Smith's descendants, Croslin and Benny. Shishash mixes with songs older than the mounds. We dance.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for this hour. Thank you for the gift of your writing. Thank you for everything. Yeah, I wish we had a million years for talking. Maybe we will in the future,
Yeah.
but I really am glad for this. Yeah. And I guess I'll ask Becky